What did Earth look like to ancient humans? You wake up, check your phone before your feet hit the floor, and by the time you're dressed, you've already scrolled past 100 pieces of information that have nothing to do with the ground beneath you. Now imagine a version of you with none of that. No feed, no clock, no walls. Just open air, every single day, for your entire life. That was the normal condition of being human for almost the whole of our existence. Not a retreat, not a vacation, the only reality there was. So here's the question worth sitting with. If you were dropped into that reality right now, would you even recognize the planet you were standing on? Because the honest answer is probably not. What ancient humans experienced, minute to minute, was a version of Earth so sensorially loud, so information-dense, that most of us today would find it disorienting rather than peaceful. Let's start above, because the sky is where the difference is easiest to measure. Under good conditions in a remote dark sky location today, a person with fully adjusted eyes might count somewhere around 2,000 to 3,000 stars. That's considered a spectacular sky by modern standards. Your distant ancestors didn't need to seek that out. It was simply what was above them, every clear night, without exception, for their entire lives. The Milky Way wasn't a rumor or a bucket list sighting. It was bright enough, in a sky untouched by artificial light, to throw a faint shadow on the ground. There's a telling modern footnote to this. During the 1994 Northridge earthquake, when a citywide blackout hit Los Angeles, local observatories reportedly fielded calls from residents describing a strange, glowing cloud overhead. It was the Milky Way. Plenty of people had simply never seen it before. That single anecdote captures the whole shift. What used to be the nightly backdrop of every human life has become, for huge portions of the modern population, a rare and almost alarming sight. But the sky was only the beginning. The real gap shows up in how fluently people read the land itself. Anthropologist Wade Davis spent much of his career living alongside indigenous communities on multiple continents, and one theme kept resurfacing. For these cultures, landscape wasn't scenery. It was closer to language, something read continuously and instinctively, the way a fluent speaker processes a sentence without translating it word by word. Davis used a phrase for the collective sum of these different ways of perceiving the world, the ethnosphere. His argument was that losing an indigenous worldview isn't just a cultural loss. It's the disappearance of an entire library of accumulated observation about how the planet actually behaves. Consider the Hadza of Tanzania, among the last hunter-gatherer communities left on Earth. Researchers who've spent extended time with Hadza trackers describe them following an animal's trail across hard, dry ground where almost nothing is visible to an untrained eye. A bent stem of grass, a faint disturbance in the topsoil, the behavior of insects that reacted to something passing through hours earlier. To them, the ground itself carries a message. To most of us, it's just dirt. Or look at Aboriginal Australian songlines, an extraordinary navigational system where entire routes across the continent, sometimes thousands of kilometers long, were encoded into songs. Each verse corresponded to a landmark, a behavior of a particular animal, or the quality of light at a specific time of year. Traveler and land and story were the same thing. This wasn't decoration layered on top of survival. This was survival, expressed as knowledge so refined it could be sung. Now picture an ordinary morning, tens of thousands of years ago, somewhere on the grasslands of what's now Eastern Africa. A small band is waking before sunrise. The fire from the night before has burned down to coals. Someone is already scanning the horizon, not out of habit, but because the horizon is useful. Its color tells you about moisture in the air. Its patterns hint at whether rain is hours away or days away. The way the wind is beginning to shift tells you something about how the day will unfold. None of this required memorized rules. It was closer to instinct, built through a lifetime, really generations, of paying attention to the same sky over the same land. Botanist and writer Robin Wall Kimmerer, a member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation, describes something similar in her own work. Many indigenous traditions treat the natural world not as a passive backdrop, but as something closer to a set of participants. Rivers behave, trees respond, weather communicates. And ancient humans paid attention, because the cost of not paying attention was direct and immediate. Missing a signal could mean missing water, missing food, missing a warning. Now think about sound, because this might be the layer we've lost the most completely. Soundscape ecologist Bernie Krause has spent decades recording wild habitats around the world, and one of his more sobering findings is that a large share of the environments he recorded decades ago have gone essentially silent since. Not quieter, but stripped of the specific insects, frogs, and birds that used to fill those acoustic niches. That silence matters more than it sounds like it should, because that soundscape wasn't ambient background to ancient ears. It was functional information, almost like a live sensor network. A sudden hush in the middle of the day could mean a predator had entered the area. A shift in the pitch or urgency of bird calls in a tree line could signal exactly that, and experienced listeners could often tell not just that something was wrong, but roughly what kind of threat it was and where it was moving. Fieldwork with the Kalahari Sand people, documented by anthropologists over decades of study, describes trackers able to distinguish dozens of distinct alarm calls from different bird species, translating them into a fairly precise picture of activity happening hundreds of meters away, well out of sight. Then there's smell, the sense with almost no fossil record, which makes it easy to forget how central it once was. The human nose is estimated to be capable of distinguishing over 1 trillion distinct scents. In a world without engines or synthetic chemicals constantly saturating the air, that capacity wasn't wasted. People could catch the smell of oncoming rain hours before it arrived, or the specific scent released by certain plants only when disturbed by a large animal moving through them. Trackers in several documented hunter-gatherer cultures have been able to identify which species left a scent trail without ever seeing a single footprint. Your nose still has most of that capacity today. It just rarely gets asked to use it. So what happened? The world didn't vanish overnight. It eroded, slowly and then quickly. Agriculture settled people down and narrowed the range of land any one person interacted with regularly. Cities packed humans into environments almost entirely disconnected from the ecosystems we evolved inside. Industrial noise buried the natural soundscape, and artificial light replaced the night sky with a permanent orange glow. Screens arrived last, and finished the job, giving our attention somewhere else to go entirely. We didn't lose this connection by accident. We traded it, piece by piece, for safety, food security, and comfort. That's not a bad trade to have made. But it's worth understanding exactly what was on the other side of the exchange. Here's where the story gets more interesting. Because it isn't just cultural nostalgia. There's real physiology underneath it. In the early 2000s, anthropologist Elizabeth Cashton published research comparing stress hormone patterns across different human populations, from urban dwellers to semi-nomadic groups in southern Africa. The finding wasn't that people living closer to nature had less stress overall. It was more specific than that. What differed was the recovery pattern. Populations living in more traditional, land-based conditions tended to show sharp, short bursts of stress tied to real, immediate events, followed by a genuine return to baseline. Urban populations, by contrast, often showed something closer to a stress response that never fully switches off. A low, constant hum of activation, with no obvious trigger and no clean resolution. Your nervous system, in other words, is still largely running ancestral software. The part of your visual system built to catch motion at the edge of your vision, originally tuned to spot a predator moving through tall grass, now fires off a small jolt of alertness at a notification sliding onto your screen. The threat detection circuitry that evolved to process real physical danger now spends its time parsing tone in a text message or the subject line of an email. Psychologist Stephen Kaplan at the University of Michigan spent years developing what's known as attention restoration theory, the idea that natural environments replenish a specific kind of mental capacity that constant urban stimulation depletes. It's not that nature is calming in some vague, poetic sense. It's that your perceptual system, once it's back in the kind of environment it evolved for, stops working against its surroundings and starts working with them. Kaplan's research found measurable effects: lower blood pressure, improved short-term memory, restored attention, after as little as 20 minutes in a genuinely natural setting. 20 minutes. After hundreds of thousands of years shaped by that environment, 20 minutes is apparently enough for your body to start remembering where it actually is. There's an even deeper layer here. Neuroscientist David Strayer at the University of Utah ran studies sending participants on multi-day wilderness trips with zero access to technology. After about 4 days, participants' scores on creative problem-solving tasks improved dramatically, in some of his published work, by roughly 50%. Strayer's explanation wasn't mystical. It was mechanical. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for focused, effortful thinking, needs downtime, much like a muscle does. In a world of constant notifications and stimulation, it rarely gets that downtime. Strip all of that away, and the brain finally gets to rest, and what emerges afterward isn't a blank mind. It's a different, broader, more associative kind of thinking. Closer, maybe, to the kind of thinking your ancestors needed when they were reading weather, tracking an animal, or weighing a dozen variables at once with no room for error. That capacity hasn't disappeared. It's just been waiting for conditions that, by default, no longer exist. Your ancestors lived under a sky that could throw a shadow from starlight alone. They moved through a soundscape so rich it took the better part of a century of industrial noise to silence it. They read the ground the way you read a sentence, and felt a shift in the wind before they consciously understood what it meant, not as a skill they had to practice, but as a language they'd never known the absence of. Most of us today step outside for less than a minute, register a color in the sky or a change in temperature, and go back in before any of it really lands. But somewhere underneath the part of you that lives indoors and reads screens and tracks time in calendar blocks, there's an older part, one that's never stopped listening and never fully lost the language.